Okay, I think we're going to get started. Folks are still joining us, but welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Taja Eisen. I'm the editor-in-chief of Orion magazine, and I am delighted to welcome you to the launch for Orion's Winter 2024 issue, Green Screen on the Nature of Film. Orion, as many of you know, is an independent nonprofit organization and a magazine that aims to invite readers into a community of caring for the planet. Our winter issue that we'll be discussing today explores representations of nature in film, the ways that, for better and worse, we portray the natural world on screen, and how those portrayals shape the way we look back at the world once we leave the cinema. Today's launch is a co-production between Orion and NRDC, a nonprofit environmental advocacy organization that uses science, policy, law, and people power to confront the climate crisis, protect public health, and safeguard nature. They have also been our generous sponsors and partners on the film issue. And in celebration of today's launch, we would like to offer you a promotional code for a 5-for-4 deal on subscriptions to the magazine, in which you will get the full slate of upcoming 2025 issues, as well as the winter issue that you will hear discussed today. And that code, which I'm about to put in the chat, is FREEW24. And I will put that there now so you have access to it. And the recording of this event will also be available, will likely be available by early next week. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panel. Joining us today are two contributors from the winter issue, Moeko Fujii and Nathaniel Rich. Moeko Fujii is a writer and critic and a film columnist for Orion, and her work has appeared in places that include The New Yorker and the Criterion Collection. Nathaniel Rich, who wrote the short story in the winter issue, is the author of the novels Odds Against Tomorrow and King Zeno, as well as two works of nonfiction, Losing Earth and Second Nature. Moderating today's conversation is NRDC's Meredith Milton, who leads NRDC's consulting work on films and TV shows, helps develop strategy, and manages key relationships with entertainment companies, guilds, and creative professionals. And I will now hand things off to Meredith to get the conversation started. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Taja, and thank you for having us here today. We're so thrilled to see all of you, and thank you to Moeko and Nathaniel for joining us. So we're going to begin today with brief readings from two pieces in the Winter 2024 issue of Orion, Cone and Through the Eye of the Fish. And Nathaniel and Moeko, before you dive into each of your readings, if you would like to, please feel free to share brief descriptions of the pieces as a whole or anything essential that you feel you would like everyone here today to know about them before our discussion begins. And Moeko, let's begin with you.
Great. Thank you, Meredith, so much, and Taja as well for leading us into this discussion today. So my piece is called Through the Eyes of a Fish, and I look at two films, the 1966 John Frankenheimer film Seconds and the 1968 2001 Space Odyssey, everyone knows, to think about how the fisheye lens was used to think about a non-human perspective on film. So I'll be reading a very brief excerpt and would love to talk to you all about it afterwards. All right. Cinema has long offered alternative windows to speculate about the natural world, a promise that we can see nature more intimately by borrowing viewpoints from creatures, such as birds, worms, or fish. Bird's eye view gives us a glance at a world that could conceivably do without us. Fisheye, by contrast, though is instantly recognizable and distinct on screen, is not the view from above or below, but from within. It dramatically registers an alternate, possibly non-human consciousness that is doing the seeing. In his 1907 book, Physical Optics, which seeks to show how light affects the way that we see the natural world, the inventor and physicist Robert Williams Wood coined the term fisheye view to ascertain how the external world appears to a fish. What is it like, he asked, for fish to see in a pond? To answer that question, Wood made a pinhole camera and filled it with water, a progenitor to the fisheye lens. The circular picture, he observed, would contain everything within an angle of 180 degrees in every direction, i.e., a complete hemisphere. Overhead, he found, things could be seen clearly, but the more you looked at the things caught at the edges of the frame, the more the image registered distortion. Unlike from bird's eye, the view from fisheye suggests that stepping inside a creature's consciousness may not be a smooth or comfortable experience. On film, the images produced by these lenses can feel unsettling to human viewers, summoning visceral reactions to the darkened edges and exaggerated swoops and swerves of movement. If bird's eye indulges the fantasy that nature is always easy to look at, like a screensaver, then fisheye picks up on the discomfort, even agony, of properly regarding the wilderness. Instead of a smooth detachment, fisheye on film takes away our sense of dominance. By making it literally difficult for viewers to see what's on screen, by intentionally courting the queasiness and form bending that accompanies the distorted image, fisheye challenges our expectations of seeing nature as a cozy enchantment that can be ordered for our gain and pleasure. And while plenty of other filmic techniques may cause unease in viewers, from sudden cuts to dancing strobe lights to lurching camera movement, these techniques still draw attention to the human hands doing the editing, lighting, and dollying. Fisheye alone has the opposite effect of erasing the human hand that has chosen that specific lens. With this erasure, we're thrust into occupying a different or non-human gaze, one that swivels back and forces us to look at ourselves.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Listening to you again, I remembered how much I loved your piece. So thank you. All right, Nathaniel, now I'll hand it over to you to read a little bit from Cone.
Thank you, Meredith. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and honored to be part of an event hosted by two organizations that mean a lot to me. So I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from a story, Cone. It's about a family. The main character is a woman named Kara, who's a film director of sorts. Her work is heavily assisted by essentially artificial intelligence. And she's been tasked with creating films that will play in an enormous theater that is sort of a surround sound wraparound LED screen called Cone. It bears a lot of similarities to the Sphere in Las Vegas, though I have to say in my defense, I started writing this story before I'd ever heard of the Sphere, but it's one of these, when you write about things that happen in the near future, I've experienced this before in my career, things tend to converge pretty quickly. So essentially it's like a sphere, except it's conical instead of spherical. And she's preparing a film. The films that show are these sort of natural, sort of next generation nature films. And she starts to notice right around the time the Cone opens that strange things are happening with the projection. And I'll read a short section about that. And I will also just say, as I've told my fellow panelists here, I have a 5-year-old home sick who may or may not burst in at any time, which might add to the dramatic quality or not. Okay. Before the full screen test, Kara had only been able to watch partial segments of the film on her laptop or, in recent weeks, projected on cross sections of the cone's interior. These projections, the size of a typical CinemaScope screen, were spectacular, at least in the way of any majestic nature documentary. A dense school of silver mackerel, tens of thousands of them, spun in an autophagic swirl, lions with dripping mouths padded across the African veld. A blue kingfisher dove from a high cliff into a green forest pool. But these coming attractions had not prepared her for the full Cone experience. Kara had spent the previous year observing from within the construction of the world's largest conical structure. She'd witnessed the careful installation of the single wraparound LED screen occupying the acreage of 8 football fields, the 200,000 speakers, the 15,000 seats, and the 5,000 vents from which the Centavision odors emanated. Kara was prepared intellectually for the scale of the thing. What she had not foreseen was its depth. During a scene in the Taman Nagara rainforest, Kara had noticed off to one side, behind a stand of dipterocarp trees, a furtive movement, a flash of claw or hoof. She walked toward it, crossing the vast auditorium to get a better view. She knew on some level that a better view was impossible. The images, no matter how realistic they might seem, played across a two-dimensional screen after all. But the dipterocarp trees pulled her nevertheless. As she approached, she detected the unmistakable scent of blood. I'll stop there.
Well done with the cliffhanger. Yeah, it's such an incredible thing that you created. I can't believe that it was even before the spear. I guess that's just how it works, right? It's like the zeitgeist. We're
These
all
things come in the culture, yeah, and I've had stories ruined that way where things I've wanted to write about happened or even, or I've sort of that used to shock me, and now I kind of take it for granted that there's like a cultural there's a zeitgeist that's kind of preceding whether or not we want to participate.
Yeah. So interesting. So I'd love, before we get into like talking specifically about each of these pieces, I'd love to hear from both of you about, how you became writers in the first place, what motivates you still in your work. Moeko, if you want to go first, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so I think I'm a film scholar at Princeton, and I've been writing the green screen column for Orion for the last 3 years. But I think fundamentally, what draws me to write about film is the experience. I'm sure you've all felt it of when you watch a really good film, you feel like you're being brought outside of yourself, and you feel like yourself is just, you feel unselved in a certain sense. And when you walk out of the theater, you feel like you really just want to talk to someone about the movie that you just watched, because it's a kind of sense of like reconstructing yourself afterwards. And that really like links to what motivates me about like writing about film. And I think you really see it in the Orion issue of this green screen issue, where there's a lot of different kinds of media, whether it's, watching natural disaster films or watching the survivalist TV show or watching Godzilla. And you see all these different writers like coming out of a film or media experience and really trying to understand their sense of self through them and their understanding of the environment. And I think for me, I think having the like thinking and rethinking nature through like looking at movies is something that I'm fundamentally kind of quite passionate about. So that's what really draws me to kind of, like interact with movies the way that I do, and continue writing about them.
Thank you. Yeah, that's extraordinary. Nathaniel, what about you?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I've always loved reading and writing, and I think more deeply than that, for me, it's really through writing that I'm able to think most clearly. And so I share a lot of what Moeko was talking about, a desire to engage more deeply and perhaps engage with some other people, even if they're invisible, with something that I'm passionate about or care about. But the other component for me is trying to understand something, usually something that puzzles me or makes me uneasy. And I think that's the source of how I came to write about environmental concerns. I didn't seek it out in any premeditated way, but I think it probably just, I found myself writing increasingly about environmental issues in fiction as well as nonfiction, because there's so much that unsettled me. Not just sort of the dismal news of the world, but also the weirdness of it, the weirdness of being alive at this time that feels like this hinge moment. I suppose every generation thinks that on some level, but this kind of fork in the road where so the future stretching out before us can take so many different forms. And also being alive at a time when we know that even in the best case scenarios that things, the world as we know it will become unrecognizable. And, how do we navigate through that? What are the kinds of strange choices and compromises that we'll have to make? Those are questions that I find deeply fascinating, in large part because I find them deeply unsettling. And so those are the kinds of stories I've increasingly sought out, and more often than not, that's led me to what we would call, environmental themes, environmental stories.
It's so interesting because it's, there can be such a tendency sometimes, particularly in like what you would consider to be like more mainstream or commercial storytelling, to tie things up neatly in a bow. But what makes a lot of work interesting is the fact that it's unsettling. It is the fact that it can't really be resolved. And I think it's, yeah, just like a fascinating tension. I also love what you said about the connection between writing and thinking, like particularly with Cone, what's going to happen to us when as we begin more and more to see this process of writing, which is so much thinking. Like I often feel like I don't even know what I think until I've written it down and had to really process it like that. So if we cede all of that intellectual process to Chat GPT, what happens next? But anyway, well, let's dive in. Moeko, I'd like to, my first question is for you. In your piece, you say that it's difficult, if not impossible, for humans to imagine a non-anthropomorphic perspective without ultimately reifying humanness by deploying metrics like the capacity for language or feeling. And this brings to mind something that Jackie Cousteau said, which is, we only protect what we love. We only love what we understand. And we only understand what we are taught. So what do you think the opportunities are to represent a non-anthropomorphic or non-human perspective in film?
I mean, that's a great question. Well, the question is like thinking about what it means to represent the environment on film, right? And for us, we usually have like a few. The environment's so interesting because it's simultaneously something that is so invisible to us, right? As the background of like, human action, but also on film, it's something that's like hyper visible, right? Like it's the natural disasters, it's like the thing that's just attacking you. And my work and just in general, I'm just really fascinated by a kind of different lineage of thinking about like the non-human on film, which is thinking of like, and you see this in like a literary tradition, like in Anna Karenina, you have like like an instance of where you see the perspective of the world through the eyes of a dog, right, a beagle, or like in Virginia Woolf, like inhabits and flush, like the again another dog, but I think on film, it's a kind of a different kind of question where what does it mean to inhabit? Like, what does it look like to inhabit someone who's not human? And like, a part of the kind of thrust of the essay is to try to think like, okay, how do we even register that? How do we register this other that is looking then at us? And for me, and I think this links to Nathaniel's answer about kind of what to do with the sense of like unease. But I think what Fisheye does is actually make us used to distortion to a certain extent, and to link this feeling of distortion and too muchness that we associate with the non-human, and then and making us settle with it. So part of my kind of questioning in this essay is like really thinking about like what does it take for us to occupy this distorting perspective. When it goes away, does it feel comforting, or does it feel actually like, does it give us a sense of more eeriness, right? What does it mean that we associate the non-human with a sense of like queasiness? Yeah, that's the kind of like way of thinking I've been thinking about.
Yeah, that's it's interesting. I mean, I was also struck, and you point this out in your piece, like when the computer dies at the end of 2001, like
Mhm.
even the death of the computer is human, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a song in its head, it has memories, like those are all of the tropes of a human death.
Yeah.
I know it's like we're just imagination in its boundaries, I guess. um, I was also struck, rereading your piece in the aftermath of the wildfires in LA.
Mhm.
My family and I lost our home and our community in the fire. And it was really interesting to read your piece reflecting on that most recent disaster that was obviously like, very front of mind for me.
Mhm.
Because you observe like how unsettling it is in seconds when the fisheye lens goes away and we return to this like pristine vision of California.
Mhm.
There's a section of it because it reminded me of like after we went into the burn zone, which is, really like the devastation is sort of like, I'm sure you've seen it in the photographs, and then
Mhm.
you drive out of the burn zone into regular life. And people are like riding their bikes through their
Yeah.
neighborhood and doing
Yeah.
their errands. And I mean, you mentioned it in your piece, right? Like that, when once Hamilton transforms into Wilson and is transplanted into his bohemian life in California, the fisheye goes away. And
Mhm.
oddly, the film is even eerier, and the
Mhm.
part that really stuck with me is that, without it, the elegance of his white linen shirts, the wicker furniture, the modernist artwork lining his walls, the sunny calm of the private beach, all so crisp, feel like a false cover for something we know is there but can't see.
Mhm.
Something about Wilson's surroundings in this beachside community, which he later has an awful realization about, is too composed, and Wilson is unsettled by the composure, as if waiting for it to crack, which is
Mhm.
exactly how I felt coming out of the burn zone. I was like, oh my
Mhm.
God, like
Mhm.
and it's kind of like it felt to me as though this threat that exists for all of us, the composure and like the veneer and the safety and normalcy and seeming permanence of our lives is this like, but underneath it lurks this other like, fisheye lens distorted truth. Anyway, how did you decide to highlight that kind of gap in perspectives?
Yeah. So you sharing that, experience of LA with me, like really, I mean, I was thinking about it. And I come from like a disaster land myself. I'm originally from Tokyo. And there, right, and there's that famous like Mike Davis way of
Yeah,
thinking about LA, which is like it's man-made disasters all the way around, but also like the imagination of disaster just chock full there. And I was in Tokyo when the 3/11 earthquake and tsunami all happened. And I remember like actually just like the thing about disaster like natural disasters happening is that it's not just one disaster. It's like 15 disasters happening all at the same time, right? You're like trying to there's just so much happening at once. So I remember really distinctly like holding on to a sense of safety and permanence. Like there's a sense of where you want to actually preserve something like that, like really just like get attached to it when there's just so much happening. Like I remember, like my school still holding a prom even though there were still aftershocks, and then the electricity would go off, so I went to my prom with half of my hair curled and one half is straight. Like it was just it's just like why, like there was like there's a necessity, I guess, for a sense of normalcy
mhm,
to move on. But I think one of the things that I think both Seconds and 2001 Space Odyssey kind of draws out for me is that there's a difference between returning to a sense of normalcy and knowing the kind of bed of, you know, kind of destruction and possible, instability that normalcy is built on, and
yeah,
willful ignorance. I think like there's a kind of, you know, quite a distinction being made there of like there's safety that's like willful ignorance in a kind of bubble, right? And a kind of primal fantasy of cleanliness and purity and nothing's going to change. And there's a sense of normalcy that you can kind of things might change, but there's adjustment period. And I think
right,
what Seconds kind of brings out for me is that like it's really asking like who profits from willful ignorance? who profits actually from people clinging on to a sense of normalcy? Because in a way, like that's also a kind of more natural human desire to want, right? To kind of have some sense of safety and some sense of wholeness being preserved. So I think like that's one thing that the fisheye does really well, which is like it brings you into a kind of ease at first, and then the more you stay with it, the more eerie it starts becoming feeling, because the first instance you feel so relieved that that the fisheye is gone, the distortion's gone, and you know, like, oh yes, prom is back. But like, and then then as things continue, the aftershocks are there, right? Like you get the sense that actually who is actually profiting from us feeling like this, from us feeling like, oh, we can all go back to normal without addressing the structural like stuff that makes these disasters happen and multiply in the first place. So yeah, thanks for that great question.
Yeah, no, and we see it, like the patterns are there, you know, the inclination to rebuild and history. Yeah, it's anyway. Nathaniel, I'd love to turn to you now. You know, Cone is obviously set in a climate altered world where air quality and pollution, you know, are the characters are relieved from those things by experiencing the purity of the cone and the world that you described, and the forests and the richness of nature, like as we now know it in our world, but that doesn't exist for them. And you know, sometimes it can feel like screens and experiences in nature are in opposition to one another. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the relationship between the two in your life and how it influenced the story.
Yeah, thank you. I'm still thinking through a lot of what Moeko said because it very resonates with a lot of the ideas that I was trying to explore in this piece. But um, I will say, first of all, that yeah, Cone takes place in a climate altered world. But in all of the particulars of that world, I mean, it's not different than our world. We're in a climate altered world. So yes, there's really bad air quality. They live in a sort of unidentified Western, smallish Western city. Um, there's terrible air quality. There's drought. There are some fires. Nothing out of step from certainly what we saw in California a month or two ago. And for a lot of the air quality details, I have some good friends who moved to Delhi last year, and I've immersed myself in some of that, what life is like in extremely poor air quality. So the only liberties I really took was creating this structure that ends up actually being like this other structure that has just been built in the West. So I feel like it's very much, I'm writing very much about now, actually. And I think you're right that there's this general anxiety, at least among certain circles, that about screens and artificiality, not only kind of dumbing us down and acting as a substitute for reality, but essentially turning us somehow cynical or turning us against the real or natural beauty. And I subscribe to some of that, absolutely. But what I wanted to write about was this conflict that emerges in the story that I think I'm also sensitive to in our world, which is in the story, the son, Kara's son, who's a teenager, is an activist. He's protesting outside of this chemical plant in the community. And he has terrible asthma that's being made worse by the air and the fires and so on. He goes into the cone and starts experiencing this immersive, sort of fake natural world, and he loves it. And for him, it's a release, and he can breathe. Of course, the air inside of the cone is like perfect air quality, um, and 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 the mother, Kara, has some of these misgivings that you referred to that I have as well. I mean, I'm pretty strict about screens, except for when I'm doing a Zoom for 200 people, and my child is homesick. But apart from this hour. Yeah, so I identify with that, and yet there's this impulse that Kara has that I also share, which is to say, well, might it be possible for somebody to still find some of these qualities that we associate with the natural world? Can they get any of that and some shape of it, some shade of it through an artificial world? And is that something to scoff at, or is that something to explore or treasure, even if they're not in, and of course it returns one to the idea that this idea of a pristine, jungle scene like the one I write about, rainforest, is itself an illusion. There's no landscape on this planet that hasn't been irrevocably altered by human intervention. There's not a square inch of land or atmosphere that doesn't bear our imprint. So then it becomes like, which lie do we, which sort of fantasy do we want to subscribe to? And is our fantasy of like the untouched wilderness of, I don't know, Yosemite or the Maine woods, is that fantasy somehow more valid than the fantasy of this like completely fake immersive screen experience? I think there's, and what if you can find the same sense of sanctity or deliverance or liberty or introspection in the artificial world? We're sort of navigating degrees of artificiality, which is not to say that, to undercut any of the major, as Moeko referred to, the major structural issues and need for action and activism and all the rest. But it occupies a kind of gray zone and a kind of gray moral zone that I feel like is a really rich one, and increasingly a kind of zone in which we all live. And so that's what I wanted to try to explore a bit and feel my way through with this story in part.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question, right? Like what we consider to be like sort of real or somehow valid in experience. I've been in the aftermath of the fires, like thinking about reflecting on the same thing with my son, who, interestingly, he has one of those like Oculus Rift headsets, the VR headsets, and he loves it. And he's loves to draw also and is an artist. And we lost everything in the fire, like everything in his room, the Oculus, all the drawings he's done since he was a child, it's all gone. And it was interesting because afterwards we decided, like, let's get him another one of the headsets. And he was really elated when he first logged back into his account in the new headset to see that all of the imagined worlds that he had experienced in the game and all the progress he'd made in the couple of games that he plays was still there. And so interesting to me as a parent who really struggles with like screen time and how much time is acceptable to spend in this virtual world. But then like I shared his relief. I was so thrilled that there was like something left that he felt that he had shared in the creation of. And I felt like, the tension in your story that exists for the mother as she's trying to figure out like what's right for my child, what do I want for my child, what do I want for myself. And I don't want to spoil the decision for the audience, like for those who maybe haven't read the story yet or don't remember it well, but the choice that she makes in the end was so profoundly sympathetic to me, and also something that I never would have anticipated myself necessarily feeling until I'd had this experience of seeing him happy after the fire and needing that so badly for him. And anyway, I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do you think that we can use these technologies to sort of inspire action and not just result in like this kind of escapism that I think you dramatize so well in Cone and ultimately might not necessarily lead us toward a solution?
Yeah, I mean, it's really moving to hear you speak about that, and as I've told you before, it breaks my heart to hear the details of your story. But it's exactly what you're living exactly this conundrum. It's easy to say, oh, this technology, these tech companies are all poisoning our brain. They're just voraciously taking our attention and all the rest. And yet you're describing like a real, clearly like this technology has real value for your son, real value for your family. Like he was able to access something that was lost, so there's something real there. I'm not going to become like an apologist for the tech companies, but and yet we're sort of, that's a more extreme version of, I think, we encounter this all the time in this country today, where you're increasingly, whether you like it or not, or whether you seek it out or not, your experiences are mediated in all these ways. And so I feel like the challenge before us as a society or as a culture going forward is can we identify what's valuable about what we're losing, and is there a way to carry that forward into the new world that we're constructing or stumbling into, however you want to put it, and focus on, how do we bring our sort of better angels with us and not just allow the sort of the more demonic forces to just have their way. And so it sounds like your son's found out one way. And to get to the broader question of activism, I mean, that feels like an almost a different category to me, and probably, that is something I would be more, I would want to know sort of what the NRDC film branch thing has to say about that. I mean, I feel like that there's the activist enterprise is a valuable one, and there are certain stories that it tells really well, and it's a necessary one. And it's the goal of motivating people to act based on some kind of cultural encounter they have, whether it's a film or a piece of writing, piece of art, is hugely valuable, and that we need more of it. But I also feel like it's not the only form of storytelling that exists. And I find in my own work, I am often drawn to environmental problems where there's not always a clear sort of activist outcome, where there's some kind of moral conundrum. There are plenty of, environmental problems where there's very, very clear outcome, and there's a clear thing to do and a clear solution. In other parts of the realm, I think it's not as clear. And the questions then become more about, how do we make the choices we make? Where do we go personally? What is our personal encounter with these vast public crises? One solution might be, a personal solution might be to dedicate oneself into the most meaningful activism one can do. But there are other avenues as well, and I think other questions that resist that kind of mold. And so I think both are important to tell, but they require sort of different skills and are.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I think I was really taken. I think it's Ayana Elizabeth Johnson who says, well, she's commenting on, there can be this tendency, I think, when people want to take action between like feeling like, being an activist or being whatever it is sort of separate from their normal lives. It's sort of like I do my day to day over here, and then on the side, I, volunteer, or I do this or I do that. And, she makes the point that really, if you want to be active and make a difference, one of the things that you can just look at is what do you do well and what are you doing in your daily life that could be aimed at the things that you care about most and could support those goals. And I think that's really inspiring because it I think for a lot of people can kind of unlock this path to like how to build that better world in like even kind of ways that may feel small, but on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think it's well put. It's also more honest. It's like it's not everybody is cut out to go to like the character in the story to go to the front lines of the protest and carry signs and do that. But that doesn't mean there are not other ways of living honestly or striving to be part of something greater than oneself, or to find some truth in a sort of fallen world. And I think I like that advice because it doesn't prescribe, a single outcome for every person and every disposition.
Yeah, I agree. All right, I'd love to, well, we have a few minutes left, take some questions from our audience today. So let's see. Oh, this is a good one. I'd love to hear from each of you if you're interested in chiming in on this. What's a film that you've seen, old or new, that has shifted the way that you look at nature today?
I have one, but I would love to hear Nathaniel's too. But I think Gunda recently really shifted how I like think about film. It's like it doesn't have a lot of cuts, and it doesn't have a lot of like technological interference. It's just like a story about by a Hungarian director about like just looking at pigs and their life, and almost forcing us to adapt to the rhythms of looking at like what pigness actually is. And no, like it's just one of those films that
Amazing.
is so slow, and yet at the same time there's no like narrative action, but there is like a kind it just the editing is so minimal, and the director was so careful about not forcing a kind of arc to it, or like a kind of technological manipulation, and he spent so much time kind of trying not to interact with it. And I thought that was actually a new model of actually thinking about interacting with the natural world, where of not action, of like staying with the pigs after you're bored even, right? Like as though as in like we're used to the Planet Earth documentary series where it's like "Rawr," and then like there's a moral lesson that kind of comes out at you, and then we go to the next region or something like that. Well, I think this director is like, no, actually, let's stay with them. Let's like go through this process of night. Let's feel like time moving while we're watching these pigs. And there's something there, I think, that's like so that asks us to rework our attention actually, and our narrative expectations when watching the natural world, that I think was quite inspiring for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess that's how you break out of your anthropomorphized perspective on, you're not trying to graft some pig story onto,
Yeah.
you know, I don't
It's
know,
not
something
Babe too,
really.
you know.
What about you, Nathaniel?
I mean, I can think of a few examples, but I feel like I'm frustrated because I feel like I'm gonna come up with the best answer as soon as this ends. But I mean, one that comes to mind that I know is a kind of polarizing one is the AI, the film that Steven Spielberg finished, that was started by Kubrick. Um, and I always remember the scene. There's a scene at the end um, that's set in a sort of New York City as Atlantis, like it's underwater. And I remember that having a big impact on me. This was probably 20 years ago or something. But the movement, there's always something about, I guess my mind went to sort of a science fiction place, which I guess is one's first impulse usually, but the movement through time, which I think of as something that's done more easily in fiction and novels, but the kind of, and some actually great narrative nonfiction. I mean, because John Muir did this kind of thing actually, and going from something very local and specific and then zooming out to eons. That kind of playing with perspective. I guess you see it in 2001 also. I mean, but there's something very viscerally, there's kind of beautiful and disturbing at the same time that stayed with me, and it felt there's a kind of aesthetic sensibility, finding beauty and wonder in something kind of bleak and terrifying, uh, that is very much like the tonal world that my writing is in. I mean, the story is in, that stayed with me in a kind of profound way. So that's what comes to mind, but I'm sure I'll have 10 better ideas in about 20 minutes.
I don't know how it works. Oh, all right, let's do. I think we have time for one more. At least I hope we do. And I'm going to do it anyway, even if we don't. Let's see. So there's another question that says, "Thank you for your pieces representing the non-human on film. Are either of you planning to make films based on your stories?" Right. Yes.
Yeah, not this story. I mean, this story in particular. Oh, I think it would be a cool film. I mean, there's yeah, I mean, there's a film that's going to come out soon. That's a that I consulted on that I can I'll give a plug to because it takes on some of these themes in a unique, fascinating way. It's called The White House Effect, and it's a documentary film, but it's done entirely through found footage. So there's no talking heads, there's no narrative, there's almost nothing graphically written on the screen. But it's a history of climate change. Um, and it focuses largely on the period I wrote about in Losing Earth in the 1980s. But filmically, cinematically, I found the approach the directors took to be profound because you're sort of in the moment. I mean, talk about sort of changing temporal perspective and um, there's a similar thing going on as to what Moeko writes about so beautifully in her piece, where you're in the 80s, you're sort of in the culture, and because there's no intermediary of a kind of present day moralistic voice or even a guide, it allows the viewer, I think, to think through this history in a different way, in a kind of a more profound way. So I'm excited to see what people make of it. It's not like any other climate film that I think has ever been made. It's inventive in a sort of fascinating way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I thought that film was really interesting when I saw it, and
Oh, you
also,
saw it? Cool.
yeah, I saw it in New York a few months ago. But yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it's yeah, and it's also this great untold history of, a very important pivot point in our path as a, civilization, that we went one direction instead of many others. And here we are, I guess, right?
I just want to say, I think Nathaniel's question of thinking actually about the artificial world as not an escape, but as like something like that just what it is like such a fascinating question. I like one of I mean, I'm not a fiction writer, so I do criticism and scholarship, but I think one thing that I do think about when I'm playing like video games of like going to artificial worlds is like can video games actually be its own form of criticism, right? Can we close read video games in the same way that close read films or literature, right? And like I do think that it does teach you to embody different like to read like to really think about alternative environments in a different way. So I think it's like really like Nathaniel's short story itself, but also his questions is like really a valuable one, which is not dismiss artificial worlds. It's like simply, a primal fantasy yet again, part two, but more like actually like what is it that we are thinking about and engaging with when we are like engaging in artificial worlds? Is it just release, or is it actually a way for us to defamiliarize the world that we actually live in too, and to like really think with it? So I mean, if that's my way of saying I would love to consult on a video game, because I do think that's like just a way of thinking.
I totally agree. Yeah, no, that's such a great point. And this weird arbitrary boundary between what we call real and what's not, like they both feel real. Um, yeah. Um, let's see. I'm going to take one more and then I guess we can wrap it up. Let's see. This discussion of disasters in the context of this conversation makes me curious to hear from the panelists. When portraying on film disrupted landscapes, disaster zones, damaged environments, etc., do you see a potential danger in the inherent aestheticization that entails? Sorry to ask a yes, no question. And also that person mentioned they're interested in hearing if there are specific examples of films that come to mind. That you think do this in an interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, a film that I'd be curious to know, Moeko, what you think of this one, but that comes to mind, although it's nothing to do with climate change, Zone of Interest,
Mm-hmm.
made of the Marnamus novel.
Yeah.
There's a similar, these sort of like false environments. You have the sort of home environment of this family, this Nazi commandant, and right outside the walls is Auschwitz, and you sort of see a little smokestack in the background, and this question of, although it's not an environmental film, it struck me as having a kind of mapping onto these questions of the reality that we shape for ourselves, what we call the real world, and what's
Mm-hmm.
outside the real world. And obviously for the family, they have one definition of the real world, and the Jews in the camps have a different. And it's absolutely an aesthetic. I mean, to the questioner's point, it's an absolute aestheticization of these environments, of a damaged environment. I don't think that's a weakness. I think that's a strength. I think it's through art that we can ask some of these deeper questions that provokes us to ask harder questions and to force ourselves to examine our own thoughts more deeply. When a work of art succeeds, it doesn't shut off avenues of communication or thought, but it enriches them or opens up new ones. So that would be my sort of knee-jerk answer is the more aestheticization, the more attempts to grapple through some of these problems, these morasses through art, the better. I think the more prepared and capable and thoughtful we will be as a culture.
Mm-hmm.
Really,
I mean, what's so fascinating about Zone of Interest, right, is the pastorals in the middle, but the film is so interested in the sound. I think the most chilling moment is just when the sound just overlaps and you're trying to distinguish what is like just it's just you're trying to figure what's going on within the sound and how to block some sound out and block some sound in and um like I think those kinds of projects are so fascinating because it's really thinking about, what can a person take actually? Like how much can a person take in a given instance? And like who is harmed in that preservatory instinct to kind of shut everything out when the sound is like almost too loud. But I think also the questioner is actually really interested, it seems to me at least, in like why we like to look at damaged landscapes, right? So this is like the difference between the pastoral question, where it's like, why do we like to look at things getting crushed again and again and again and again? And like, I think for me, um, I like films, disaster films that like, there is the kind of pleasure of watching like, you know, um, buildings being destroyed. But there was a piece in this issue about Godzilla, and there was this like new version, the Hideaki Anno Evangelion director version of it, which is so much about like the ineptness of the bureaucracy to handle all the different kinds of like disasters that's going on. And actually it's like a critique of the kind of present day. So I think if the aestheticization, right, like the Godzilla, like burning and like smashing and that, like the pleasure of watching that is actually, a way of thinking through how slow the bureaucracy is and how inept our government is. I think like those two often come hand in hand actually, and disaster films and horror films too are a way of like thinking about like, and genre films are a way of thinking about questions that might be boring to talk about in the everyday, but like is brought in with like a packet of sugar. So yeah.
Mhm. Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much, Moeko and Nathaniel. Taja, I think we're at our time, which I'm sad about. Anyway, I'll hand it off to you for conclusion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Meredith, for facilitating such an engaging conversation. And thank you to Moeko and Nathaniel for your time and your contributions. And thank you all so much for joining us. In one last plug for this issue, I will say, related to that final question and the conversation that our panelists were just having, there is a piece in the issue that kind of addresses exactly this question, which is, what sort of gets lost in this sort of, in the disaster films framing of crisis as this strange moment of catharsis, and are there films that think outside of that framework? And the film that the writer is based here in Las Vegas, where I also live, which, you know, it has itself been a sort of interesting location for post-apocalyptic storytelling. And the film that he posits as a sort of alternative is Roman Polanski's Chinatown. So I share this as part of reminding you of our promo code, our 5 for 4, that I'll put in the chat one more time. And a copy of the recording of this event will be available hopefully by early next week. And other than that, thank you all so much for joining us. This was a really stimulating conversation. This was my first Orion virtual event as the new editor-in-chief, which was a real thrill for me. And I thank you all for your time and attention and collaboration.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank
so
you,
much.
Meredith.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.